Okay. Good evening, everybody. I hope you have a book. If you don't have the book, I will tell you where we're going to be discussing in the portion. And so you'll be able, if you have a chumash, that will be second best. Okay. Good evening, everybody. We're holding this week Parsha's Boy. Parsha's Boy means to come, and it has within it two letters. Beis and Aleph will equal up to 3, and our sages tell us that's because that's the 3 plagues that are mentioned in this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha, we talk about the 3 last plagues. Arba, Choshech, Makis, B'chayris. The locust, the darkness, and the death of the firstborn in Egypt. But the beauty of the Parsha comes at the end of the Parsha, closer to the end of the Parsha, which talks to the Jewish nation. We're going out of Mitzrayim. We're going out of Egypt. The first commandments that were given to the Jewish nation. As a nation, God starts a nation. In this week's Parsha, the Jewish nation creates an Am Yisrael. Creates a Jewish nation. He gives them mitzvahs, gives them commandments. The commandment of Pesach, Korban Pesach, the whole Passover Seder is based on this week's Parsha. So this it's a fascinating end of the Parsha. It's really a fascinating completion of Parsha, which is the connection of the Jewish people, the beginning of the Jewish nation. We sing on every Yontiv, we sing Ata B'chartana Mikol Ha'amim, that we sing on the holiday Ata B'chartana, you have chosen us from all the nations. This is what happened on this Parsha, Parsha's Boy. And we have the whole purpose of the Seder, that we sit at the Seder every year and we celebrate the holiday of Pesach, is in this week's Parsha, is at the ending of this week's Parsha. So it's important to learn the Parsha, because as we know, it's told, the Gemara says, that you're not only obligated to celebrate the Seder on Pesach, you're obligated to celebrate the Seder every day. Every single day we have to celebrate the going out of Mitzrayim, the going out of Egypt, which happens in this week's Parsha. This is a beautiful sikh of the Rebbe, which the Rebbe talks about what God says, the reason that God took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. And the most important reason, and that's why we come together every year on Pesach, because of this reason, because of the reason why God took us out of Mitzrayim, that we would get together every year and we would celebrate the Seder, and the reason why we celebrate the Seder. And that is, this class starts off in the student book on page 33, and there's a beautiful verse in this Parsha. As we go through the class, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. So we are starting, this class starts actually in, starts in Bereshis, where Avram Avinu, God tells Abraham what is going to be mentioned in this week's Parsha, and that is in Genesis chapter 18, verse 19. I know him because he instructed his children and his household after him, that they would keep the ways of God to perform the righteousness and justice. Therefore, God will bring upon Abraham the blessing that he spoke to him. And therefore, the Torah tells us also in this week's Parsha that you should gather your children and you're going to tell them the Korban Pesach. You're going to come together on the night of Passover, and you're going to teach them, you're going to educate them, and you're going to tell them about what happened in Mitzrayim, and especially about what happened about their going out of Mitzrayim. The aspect of Jewish education to transmit to children. And over here, this Sikha, the Rebbe emphasizes the aspect of education of children, but I believe that the concept of education of children is not only to children in age or your own children, but as you'll see in the Torah, we all call the children of God, and therefore it's an obligation for us to educate everybody themselves, and the obligation to educate another person. We know that our sages tell us if you educate another person, it's called your child. We learned that from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu educated his nephews, Aaron's children. The Torah calls them his children. So education, even though the law of education, as you see in the class, is an obligation on a parent, but the truth is we all need to step into the parenthood when it comes to education and the importance of reaching out to our fellow brethren, to our fellow Jews, and to educate them. As the Lubavitch Rebbe would say, if you know an Aleph, you need to teach an Aleph. So everybody knows an Aleph, hopefully, on this Zoom, on this Facebook lesson. Everybody knows something of Yiddishkeit, and they know somebody else out there that doesn't know that. You have an obligation. It's your obligation to go out there and teach your fellow. Doesn't make a difference whether age they are. Teach them the letter Aleph. Teach them the letter Bein. Teach them the beauty of Yiddishkeit, the beauty of Judaism. It's why the Eibishter took us out of Mitzrayim. It's why we sit at the Seder. The reason is to tell them the story. Tell them about this going out of Egypt. Tell them about the mitzvahs that God has given us. And this started off all the way from Avraham Avinu, all the way from Abraham. That God chose Abraham for that reason, and God chose each and every one of us, and He chose us in this week's Parsha for that reason, that we would be educators. Each and every one of us would be educators. And the Rebbe says in text number 1b, God cherished Abraham primarily because he instructed his children in his household. Now the word instruct, yitzaveh, can also mean connect. We know in Chassidus, the aspect of a mitzvah, which is the same root word as tzivui, is the concept of connection. In other words, all of Abraham's achievements pale in comparison to his instruction and connection of others as well. That's the reason why we're here, to make a mitzvah, to make a connection, and to give others the capability to connect. It's not only enough, as the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, it says, Lilmoid ulalamed. There's an obligation to learn, and there's equally an obligation to teach. You cannot wait for the rabbis to teach everybody. It's impossible. Everybody needs to become a teacher. That's why God chose the Jewish nation. They'll become a teacher to themselves, to others, and ultimately a light to the world. We need to teach the entire world. That's our job. We are the teachers of the world. That's our obligation. You cannot sit back and say, I've learned and I don't need to teach anybody else. No, that's not what the Torah asks from a Jew. And that's not why God chose Abraham. And that's not why God took us out of Mitzrayim. Moshe Rabbeinu, as we mentioned last week in the class, Moshe Rabbeinu was called Moshe, and the answer was, the Torah says, Ki min hamayim mishisihu. We mentioned this 2 weeks ago, I believe. Because you drawed him from the water. So our sages asked, he should have been called Moshe. Why is it called Moshe? And the answer is because Moshe means he will draw others. She said, I saved you, so you'll save others. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu became the Moshe Rabbeinu, the Moses, the teacher, the educator of his generation, and the educator of all generations. Till today, we call him Moshe Rabbeinu. Even though Moshe Rabbeinu hasn't been here for thousands of years, he continues to be Moshe Rabbeinu. Because once you're an educator, you've taught a child the letter Aleph, or you taught a child the whole Aleph base, now he can teach his children. You become the educator of generations. Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Torah to his generation. They transmitted to the next generation, and they transmitted it to generations to come. Being an educator is a responsibility. It's not a simple job. So therefore, even though I just now asked everybody to be educators, you need to know how to be an educator. You need to know how to educate. And therefore we are told exactly how to educate. And there's a very famous statement in the Mishnah. You can see in text number 2 on page 34. This is a text from the Malbim. The Malbim says, train a child according to his way. Train a child, you want to educate? You need to educate each person according to his way. Even when he grows up, he will never turn away from it. Realize, you educate somebody, and this is not only an age, because the Mishnah says, don't look at the vessel, but what's in it. You can find an old vessel that doesn't have even new wine in it, and you can find a new vessel that has old wine in it. It's not the age that's important over education. The one thing that has no time value is education. Learn something, learn it well. Teach something, teach it well. So that, and if you teach it well, and you know the student, so you know how to teach it to the student, so that the student will be able to comprehend. You know that teaching will never leave the student, will always influence the student. It will be part of him, and he will tell it to others. Somebody actually came to me just today and told me I repeated what you spoke on Shabbos at this, and that's really nice. That means that it impressed the person what I said. I was impressed with the teaching. It was not my own teaching. It was something that I taught somebody else. I was impressed with it to teach it, and she was impressed with it to teach it to somebody else. And hopefully that person will be impressed with it to teach it to somebody else. And this will be an everlasting and endless chain of teaching. So the Malbim explains. He says, this means that education must be tailored to the student, because every person's natural adaptivity to something else. You have to know your student. It's very difficult on Zoom to know your student. You can't even see them. So you got to know your student. That's why I ask people to show their face. I can see their expression maybe a little bit. Know your student. Know your teaching. That's why it's important to ask a question, because it's very hard to know a student if the person doesn't ask. So it's important that when you teach, you know who you're teaching. So you tailor it to the student. Intellectually, some are sharp, while others are more straightforward. And each needs to be taught accordingly. Or in skill sets, each has their own particular niche. This is the Malbim. Wrote on a verse, teach a kid according to his ways. He does emphasize the word darkei. You can't teach a kid you can't teach one teaching to everybody the same. Everybody understands things different. Therefore, you need to tailor it. Tailor it. My friends, as an educator, I've been teaching, just like it's for children, it's for adults too. Adults you need to be able to talk to them. The Alter Rebbe in Chassidus says you need to be able to talk to yourself. You need to know what your nefesh. I need to know my nefesh abam is, my animalistic soul. What is his niche? I can't just talk to him holy words. It's not going to affect him. I need to be able to talk to him till he'll understand it. He'll comprehend me. An educator can identify these by examining what the student is naturally attracted to and strives for. Once identified, the educator must tailor their instruction according to each student's internal makeup and skill set. If one follows this approach, then even when he grows old, he will not turn away from it. Every educator should learn this, the Malbim. And the truth is, like I said, we're all educators. We all need to learn this. This is a great lesson in essence, in any aspect, when we want to communicate. Something that we struggle today with communication, how to communicate one's philosophy to somebody else. We need to know what that person is interested in hearing, what that person wants to hear, what he wants to, what excites him. However, if one educates a child without taking the unique natural inclination into account, the instruction will fail the test of time. It will fail the test of time. He's going to forget it. He's going to listen because he has to. He's a student. He's stuck in a class. But it will totally fly over him. Comes the very famous statement of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab, in text number 3 on page 35 of your book, the Rebbe Rashab said, the Rebbe Rashab was the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe. He said as follows. This was a very powerful statement of his. He said, just as putting on tefillin every day is a scriptural commandment incumbent upon every Jew needs to put on tefillin. It's a pasuk in the Torah. Regardless of whatever it's great scholar or a simple person, so too, it's an absolute obligation for every Jew to dedicate time every day to think about his children's education. And again, I don't think it means that whether you have children or you don't have children, your children are wonderful, it has nothing to do with that. Education. Whether it's your children or somebody else's children, whether it's your neighbor, a friend, you got to think about this. We are afraid of approaching somebody else and trying to give him over something of Yiddishkeit that we have. Therefore, you need to think about it. You need to take time and think about how to do this. How am I going to reach out to another person? Or how am I going to educate my child? It's all the same. It's all the same concept. Doesn't change whether it's my child or somebody else's child. I have an obligation of education. Excuse me, I'll just turn this off. I apologize. My daughter's calling me from California. Education. I have to. My own child. She's calling me. She'll hang in there. So it's important that we take the time. We must do everything in their power, and indeed more than. They have to do more than just their power. To be able to think about what must in their power, indeed more than what is their power, to see that our children follow the path in which they are guided. We need to teach them. We need to take the time. It's not something that we just can throw into somebody else or say it's the teacher's problem. It's everybody's problem. We need to take the time to put ourselves and to figure out how do I educate somebody else? Again, what's the whole Seder? The whole Seder is the concept of education. It's the concept of Montesapra, as I said in the beginning, the obligation to tell your children. the obligation to tell somebody else. It all is the concept of education. And let's go into the obligation. The Rebbe says, let's go into the obligation. So let's look, and we can learn it from, how can we learn the obligation of education? The best way is to learn it from the parent. We can learn it from the parent's obligation to every person's obligation. Because again, it's not only the parent's obligation, as we learn that it's everybody's obligation to teach, to educate. Every person needs to become a parent when it comes to the concept of teaching. So let's learn the simple law of the obligation of teaching. So therefore it says in text number 4, the Malbim, which we mentioned before, the commentator on Torah and on Jewish law, he says one must begin educating their child from a very young age, training them to be wholesome. This training should include intellectual pursuit, proper behavior, and desirable character traits. It needs to begin earlier, because whatever a child will be accustomed to in a young age will develop into strong habits and leave their impression upon him or her for the rest of his life. It's important to start young, my friends, self-understood. It's important to start young. When you see a neighbor that has children, it's important to get them into Jewish education. Let's not wait till the bar mitzvah or till they go to college. Let's start young. Let's start off Jewish education as young. The younger, the better. The Gemara says, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, in ethics, says, Father, what's the difference teaching an older person or a young person? An older person is like a paper that's totally written on. Now we have to erase it. We have to erase some of the paper to put on new information. We could do that. And if we have to, that's what you need to do. But when you have a young, it's an empty piece of paper. So the best thing is when you take an empty piece of paper. But the truth is, when we all go to learn, we should all go to learn like a child. There was once a great sage, Rava, in the Gemara, said, I wish I could pray like the prayer of a child. Because when a child prays, it's like an empty sheet. He prays to God. He doesn't have too many complications. If we all can pray like a child and all go to learn like a child, we would learn much better. It wouldn't be a filled up mind. It's very hard to fill a mind that is full already. First, you have to empty out your mind. You want to come to learn, empty out your mind. That's the best way to educate other people, is tell them to listen. First, you got to listen. You're not coming to learn to challenge. There's always a place for challenging what you learn. You're coming to learn to listen, to hear something new. Maybe something you didn't know. If the training begins at a later age, however, the habits will not become deeply embedded. It's much more difficult. And with the passing years, will eventually fade. And the best thing, self-understood, is to educate a child. That will be the best. It's much more deep, much more difficult to educate an adult. But it doesn't make a difference. There's no concept of impossible. And therefore, we have many stories in the Talmud where Rabbi Akiva started to learn alphabet at 40 years old. Everything is possible. If a person wants to study, a person wants to learn, there's nothing that can stop him. He can put aside everything and start to learn. But one of the most important principles of Jewish learning is that the learning is not a subject. Learning is not a subject. Like if you go to school, you learn a subject. It has nothing to do with your life. That's not the way Torah wants to be learned. Torah education in Torah is we're trying to educate somebody that the learning becomes part of them. So in which way do we see the learning that I learn? I educate myself, or I can educate my friend, or educate a child. Which way do I see that the education actually has an influence is in the next statement. Very important statement. One must begin to train and educate the child to develop good and upstanding character traits. So important that education goes with derech eretz. Is a famous statement I've been brought up my whole life with. Derech eretz kodma l'Torah. Derech eretz, decency, respect, human respect, decency, menschlichkeit, comes even before the learning of Torah. Torah needs to make a person respectful, decent. It's important that a person has that decency, that the education educates him to be a mensch, to become a better refined person. They once caught, I did a story, I don't know if it's true or not, they once caught a Spinoza, the great philosopher. They say it I heard the story in different great philosophers. They once caught a Spinoza in an immoral act. And they told him, you're the great philosopher. How is it possible that you would do such an immoral act? And he answered, there's Spinoza the philosopher, and there's Spinoza the human being. I'm still a human being. That's not what the Torah wanted to accomplish with the learning of Torah. The learning of Torah was to make a person a better person, to make a person a mensch, to make exemplary character traits. And when you talk about a child, that would be the best that we can give him, derech eretz, decency, before even learning Torah, so that the Torah that he learns would make him even better. The Alter Rebbe writes in text number 6, the Alter Rebbe wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. He says a father is responsible to educate his son and his daughter to observe all the commandments. Consequently, if he finds his child violating a commandment, he must ensure they stop and make sure that they know that it's improper behavior. The above applies even to rabbinical edicts. The Torah obligates a person. You cannot say, see no evil, hear no evil. That's not the Jewish way. A person sees somebody that is doing something wrong, he should be able to know how to approach him and to be able to rectify him, to make sure he doesn't do something that is not the right thing. We have to know how to do that. That's even harder than to tell a person to do something good. To tell a person not to do something bad is even more difficult, and it has to be done in the right manner. It has to be able to be transmitted in the right way. But that's an obligation. It's an obligation of a parent. It's an obligation on us to somebody else. That's why God took us out of that's why God chose Abraham. That's why God chose the Jewish people in this week's Parsha, to be a light unto the nations. You have to educate them to do right, and educate them for not doing bad. Teach the world how to be mentioned. Teach the world how to be ethical, how to be moral, how to be a mensch, how to be civilized, how to be compassionate. The best way to teach is by example, by one's own example. So when does this obligation end? We can learn this from a child. This is all an education we learn from the child. When does the obligation end? When does the obligation of my child end? When it becomes an adult? Does my obligation end when it comes to an adult? It's an argument. You know, there's a tradition by a bar mitzvah at least. The father says after the son gets called to the Torah, he says, Baruch shepatrani ma'ina shalazeh. I want to thank God for getting rid of this pain. Not really a pain, this punishment. Because until he's 13, the father officially takes the responsibility of the child's sin. By Chabad, we don't say God's name in this prayer. We say the blessing, but we take out the name of God in that prayer. Because the question is, am I out of the obligation? Just because my son came bar mitzvah, my daughter became bas mitzvah, do I walk away from this obligation? Does education end? So we have to find it in Jewish law. When does that obligation end? So we're going to bring this law. Text number 7, the Gemara says a father is obligated to circumcise his child, to redeem him, to teach him Torah, to marry him off, and to teach him a trade. And some say a father is also obligated to teach his son to swim. So we find an interesting law over here in this whole group of laws where a father's obligated. First of all, you can see that's after bar mitzvah already. You're obligated to teach him a trade. You're obligated to marry him off. You're obligated to teach him these things that are past bar mitzvah age. But here comes the essence of this class, because here we bring in the concept of this is not an obligation only to the child, your child, but it's absolutely an obligation to every Jew. And we find an interesting expression, an interesting law in this week's Parsha. In chapter 13, verse number 1 and 2, in your page 38, we have the law. The Torah gave a law. God says to Moses, saying, Kadesh li kol b'cher. I want you to sanctify every firstborn to me. Petach harechem le'isol. Every one of the open womb, firstborn of their mother. Ba'adim b'behema li. Every firstborn son belongs to me. What do you do with a firstborn child? If it belongs to God, what does that mean? And what's the ramification of that? Well, we all know the mitzvah of pidyon haben. This comes into the law of a mitzvah of being paida, redeeming your first son, your first child. You have to redeem him. This all happened in this week's Parsha, the last plague, the plague of the death of the first child of Egypt. God said, when I saved every Jewish first child, I acquired him. I acquired that first child. And there's a reason why God did that, as we'll soon see in a moment. That I acquired the first child, and therefore the way you're going to be able to, I acquired him, so I'm going to give you a mitzvah. I acquired this child, so I'm giving you another mitzvah to do for this first child, and that is pidyon haben. To redeem the first child. And this is an important mitzvah. I meet many people who haven't done this mitzvah for their children, even though their children are adults. They didn't know there's a mitzvah to be paida, to redeem their first child. So the Torah continues and says in page 39 in your book, 8b, it says that you shall redeem every first donkey, so too you have to redeem every first donkey and lamb. If you do not redeem them, you shall decapitate it. And every firstborn of man amongst your sons you shall redeem. So what's the mitzvah? What's the actual mitzvah? So you have in text number 9, Maimonides says, by a biblical positive commandment, each Israelite must redeem his son, the firstborn of an Israelite woman. As the verse states, every firstborn belongs to me. And it's written, you shall have your firstborn of man redeemed. This duty is applicable everywhere and at all times. For what price does he redeem him? For 5 shekel, as the verse states. The redemption price of the child is 1 month, is equivalent of 5 shekel. So on the 31st day, after 30 days, you have to redeem your child. Now the question is asked, who's obligated to redeem the child? Is a child obligated to redeem itself? Or is the parent obligated to redeem the child? That means, is it the obligation of the child, but he cannot do it, he's 30 days old. So therefore the father does it for the child? Or is it the obligation of the father to do it for the child? And this is a great debate in the Talmud. Is it the obligation of the child being redeemed, or is the obligation of the father? And it makes a big difference. Because what happens when the child becomes older? The father didn't redeem him. Who's obligated now to redeem the child? Is it the obligation of the child to redeem himself, because he was always obligated to redeem himself, but he couldn't do it when he was 30 days old? And now he's an adult, so let him redeem himself. Or was it always the obligation of the father to redeem him, and therefore the father should continue to redeem him, even though the child is 20, 30 years old? That I just gave you a Gemara challenge, a debate in the Talmud. The truth is, both are correct, because in halacha, really, the father's not going to redeem the child should redeem himself as he becomes an adult, but the father can redeem the child even when the child's an adult. That means if I meet a father whose child is already 25 years old, he should redeem him. If the father doesn't want to redeem the child for whatever reason, the child needs to redeem himself. The child needs to do the mitzvah. But really, the father, even when the child is 20, 25 years old, he can still do the mitzvah. So if he hasn't done the mitzvah for whatever reason, didn't know such a mitzvah, didn't know there was such a law, doesn't make a difference. He can still redeem his child. Even though his child's an older child and he's married, has his own kids, he can still redeem his child. Still have the obligation to redeem his child. His mitzvah started at 30 days old, and the mitzvah will continue until he does the mitzvah. That's what the Rebbe writes in text number 10. You have it there. The Rebbe writes, I want a particular difference between the two approaches. If the father, for whatever reason, neglected to redeem his firstborn while a baby, he will be obligated to pay the 5 coins when the child grows up an adult. According to the first approach, that the redemption is the essential in the son's mitzvah, the adult son would naturally be obligated to redeem himself, to pay the money. According to the second approach, that's the obligation of the father. However, that to redeem his son is his father's own mitzvah. So even after this child turns to an adult, the father retains his obligation to perform this redemption. This is the lesson. The obligation of a parent of education does not end, even when the child is adult, to educate himself. Even though the child is an adult to redeem himself, it's still the obligation on the parent to redeem his child. Education never ends. The Eibishter gave, as you'll soon see, the vacation, because education, these things what the Mishnah says, what is an obligation on a father to his child, is not an obligation. It's a schus. The Eibishter gave the parent a merit, because really it belongs to God. God gave you a merit to be paid to your child, to do a mitzvah with your child. Why did God do that? Why did God do that? That God said, I'm going to choose the first child over the Egyptian first child, and making the first child special. And the answer is because every Jewish person is called a first child. In text number 11a in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22. You can look it up if you don't have the book. You can look up this verse. This is a very important verse that every Jew should know. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22. V'amartel Parai. God says to Moshe, and tell Parai, Koyamar Hashem. This is what God says, B'ni b'chayri Yisrael. My firstborn son is Israel. The entire Jewish nation is called the first son. Every one of us is a b'chor. Every one of us, that's like God said, I chose the first son, and you have to be paid to him. You have to redeem him. Every Jewish child needs to have, every Jewish person. It makes a difference. What age? And when it says B'ni b'chayri Yisrael over here, God is not talking about a gender. Talking about man, woman, and children. Or as the Torah says in Deuteronomy, this is another very powerful verse. When the Torah tells a Jew not to do something negative, Torah tells him, I'm not telling you not to do something negative because I'm commanding you. You're my child. You're my child. This is not a relationship between master and servant. This is a relationship between child and father. You are me. By you doing something negative, you're doing negative to me. We're family. You're my child. This is another very powerful verse in the Torah. Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. The Eibusha turns to the Jewish nation. This is what Rabbi Akiva said in Ethics of Our Fathers. This is a very powerful verse. God turns around to the Jewish nation and he says, you are my children. You're my children. And therefore, do not do negative things to yourself. Do not do negative, because I'm a king and I can make decrees. You're my child. I care about you. Why would you do things to yourself? Over here, the Torah is talking about making boldness and scraping yourself and hurting yourself. You're my child. What does that have to do with your age? What does that have to do with your status? You're my child. If a person would realize that he's a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's a child of God. It's not about rules and regulation. It's about relationship with God. We're family with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're family with God. So Rabbi Akiva said, the Pasuk said, we are called the children of God, and the Pasuk tells us that. God doesn't keep it a secret. It got us a lot in trouble, this verse. We suffered a lot as Jews because of this verse. But that's the verse. The Torah tells us, you're my child. Whatever that means, and trust me, there's a lot of interpretations to this verse. Both of these verses. Two very powerful verses. B'ni b'chayri Yisrael. Imagine Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the king of Egypt. And he tells him, you know, you're the king. And you're putting all these people in slavery. But these people that you're putting in slavery, and you think you have the power, trust me, they are the firstborn, B'ni b'chayri Yisrael. They are the firstborn of the Jewish of God. You're playing with fire. He learned the hard way. But you're playing with fire. But the truth is, this is something we need to educate ourselves in. This is something we need to educate our fellow Jews in. We shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed to teach our own brethren these verses of the Torah. Tell them who they are. If we can tell the Egyptian king who he is, who the Jewish people are, we should be able to tell our brethren who they are. The Gemara, Rashi, look at text number 12, page 42. The sages taught there are three partners in a person's creation. The Holy One, blessed be He, the father and the mother. When a person honors his father and mother, the Holy One, blessed be He, says, I ascribe credit to them as if I dwelt between them and they honored me as well. So if you're a mensch, God says you're honoring me. So Rashi says on this Talmud, this was a statement in the Talmud, Rashi says, there are three partners. Elsewhere, the Talmud explains, the man gives forth the white parts of the baby, the woman provides the red, and God provides the soul. God provides the soul. By breathing into this baby, this soul is that enables the body to see and hear and speak. This is the way the Alter Rebbe translates the verse, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem, in the second chapter of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem means that we have a godly soul. We have a godly soul that comes, and the analogy is like a child that comes from his father. The godly soul has within it a spark of God. And therefore, it says specifically by the Jewish nation, that you are the children of God. So here the Rebbe says it in a different way. He says, look at this wording in page 43. I hope you have the book, because these are expressions of the Rebbe that we should all read and ultimately comprehend. Every Jewish child is God's child. We call God our Father in heaven. The biological father and mother are merely God's messengers who are given the merit to give birth to raise, to educate this special child. So the Rebbe says, what does it teach us? You cannot look at a person or even your own child as something that belongs to you. No, you had the merit. I had the merit to bring down these children. They belong to God. They are the children of God like I am a child of God. They are precious like I am precious. The Rebbe wanted that every person to look at every Jew out there as a son of HaKadosh, the child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's precious, as equally as precious as he is. Trust me. Just like when the Jewish people went out of Egypt, Moses was a holy man. Most of the Jews that left here were slaves. They had no knowledge, no comprehension. But Moshe Rabbeinu treated them. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu was called a shepherd, a faithful shepherd. He treated all Jews like precious. He treated all Jews equal. Why? Because, what do you mean? God told him, said these verses to him. He knew these verses. How is it possible to look at another Jew in a negative way when he's a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Oh, but he comes from this parents. He has this kind of physical reality. What does that have to do with that? He still has the partnership of God. You know, I started off the class with saying, that says, Ato Bechartanu, we sing it every holiday. You chose the Jewish nation. When did God choose the Jewish nation? Today, in this week's portion. Before the Jewish people went out of Egypt, God chose the Jewish nation. Chose a nation of what? They had a Torah? No. They had great philosophy? No. They didn't receive the Torah, another 50 days. We have to go through next week for Mashalach, and then we come to the portion of Yisrael, which in 2 weeks, we're going to come to the giving of the Torah, which took 50 days. So God chose the Jewish nation before he gave them the Torah. So the rabbis asked, why didn't God choose the Jewish nation first give them the Torah, then choose them as a nation. Why do you choose a nation before giving you the Torah? And the Rebbe would say this many times, because God chooses a Jew not because what he's going to do or not going to do. God tells every Jew, you are my child, whether you do or you don't. Whether you're following every law or you don't. As a father, I would love you to follow everything because you're my child. But you're still my child if you don't follow anything. I still love you, whatever you do or you don't. And that's why God specifically didn't choose a nation and specifically did it before the giving of Torah. Because God in essence said to the Jewish nation, I love you, I've chosen you, whatever you're going to do or not do. Again, as a father, any parent would love their child to be perfect, to be wonderful, to do everything that they're supposed to do, and not to do anything that they shouldn't do. But does any father or mother give up on a child? Does any father or mother hate a child? Not if they're healthy parents. They might not like what the child is doing. They still love the child. We are the children of God. Every Jewish person out there is a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You need to tell them that. You need to meet them that. You need to meet them. You need to meet a Jew and tell them that. And now the Rebbe, to the women on this class, I want you to hear the next text. Because here, the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives the job that I just said more to the women than to the men. Are you ready? Oh, my wife, I see, got on the good. So this is very important to all the women to hear this paragraph. To listen to this paragraph, text number 14, as we come closer to the end of the class. Moreover, women have a special advantage over men when it comes to education. Women know how to talk better than men. Khani, is that true? Women know how to communicate better than men.
I wouldn't say better, different.
I don't know, better. Look at the tag. It comes to education and even to discipline. The feminine qualities in a woman allow them to impart their guidance with intimate closeness, soft-spoken, love, and affection. Much more than men can offer. This is not me. This is Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's it. The Rebbe puts this obligation on the women in this class. More than men. This is especially pertaining in the recent times when it's precisely the loving and warming approach to education, as we said before, training according to his way, and that's the way of this generation. This generation doesn't want to hear rebuke. This generation wants to hear love. This generation wants to be told good things, not negative things. That bears more fruit, and women know how to do it better than men. So why am I giving this class? I don't know. But okay. I got permission from my wife to give the class. So women know how to do this better than men. And therefore, I believe that Rebbe would say this many times, that it says in the merit of the Jewish women that we went out of Mitzrayim. In their merit, we went out of Egypt because of their self-sacrifice and the way they handled the whole slavery. And not only that, but the way they handled, as we go from slavery into Egypt, into desert, the way the women handled the whole journey of the desert. So it was in their merit, the Gemara says, we went out of Egypt. It was in their merit we received the Torah. is in their merit that we survived the desert, and that these are rights. It's going to be in their merit that we're going to go out of Golis. We're going to go out of the last exile. So I'm handing over the baton to you guys. It's in your merit. Get to work. You gotta go out there, and in your, as the Rebbe writes of it, in your soft-spoken love and affection and closeness way, you have to know how to do this job better than us men. So here the Rebbe, let's end off with the last statement of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on this topic. So to all the women, again, listen closely. When the Mishnah says, the Rebbe says, when the Mishnah says there are three partners in a forming of a person, the person's father, mother, and God. The division of responsibilities in this partnership is as follows. The biological parents are responsible for the spiritual welfare of the children, meaning to say God entrusted them with an extremely precious deposit, a godly soul from on high, with hope and expectation that the parents will complete their assignment and see to it that his child's soul be overtly expressed in everything he or she does. A job well done means that when looking at this child, one should be able to identify that this is a member of the nation that is told by God, you shall be to me a kingdom of princes and a holy nation. We have to educate our fellow Jew. We have to bring out the light within him. We have to bring out the soul within him, the godly soul. That's our obligation, to reveal the godly neshama that's within him. But when it comes to that's really our obligation. When it comes to the physical needs of the child, that he be properly fed, clothed, and be healthy, that is God's share of the partnership. We're mixing up the partnership, the Rebbe says. We're mixing up the partnership. The Eibishter gives parnasa. We're worried about parnasa, the physical side of another person. It's important, but that's God's obligation. He brought the person to the world. He needs to make sure that that the person has success and financial stability. Why did God send a person to the world? To reveal godliness in the world. Why did he send him a child to the world? That he would reveal his godliness. You'll be able to live like a better Jew. Why did God bring you or introduce you to another Jew? Why did God introduce you to another Jew? Why do you know another Jew on your block? Is that you would be able to reach out to them, to be able to reveal their neshama. And when the parents observe their side of the partnership, by educating their child to be an upstanding Jew, then God observes his side of the partnership. By providing the parents with all their needs, whatever it be finance or health, the Eibush will do his partnership. Let's do our partnership, the Rebbe says, and God will do his partnership. God says, B'ni b'chayri Yisrael, you are my children. You need to educate your children. You need to educate somebody else's children. You need to educate your friend that he is a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's our job. We ultimately need to educate the world that they are all humans and they're all B'Tselem and Akim. They're all created in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're all created in the image of God. That's our obligation. Let the physicality of the world, God take care of the physical side of the world, and we'll take care of the spiritual side of the world. And that's why God says in the Torah, the song that we sing, Ata bechatonu mikol ha'amim, you've chosen us from all the nations, and you've given us a Torah, you uplifted us and you gave us a Torah, so that with this Torah, we will be able to bring about the concept of education to ourselves, education to our children, to education to our fellow Jew, and ultimately the education to the entire world. And it all started off, my friends, in this week's Parsha, Parsha's Boy, that you'll come to Mirshem on Shabbos, or you're reading it during the week, the Chitas, you're learning it the entire week. You are studying the beginning of the Jewish nation, the choice and the beginning and the purpose and the journey of Am Yisrael that started off not by the giving of the Torah per se, but actually by the going out of Egypt, which happened in this week's Parsha, in the portion of Parsha's Boy. It's a beautiful sikha of the Rebbe. It's a very interesting and very deep sikha, the importance of our obligation to others and obligation to another Jew, especially to our children, to be able to reach out to them. And therefore we know to those that are their children or older children, you still have an obligation to the best of your ability to educate them and give them, inspire them to get in touch with their neshamas, to get in touch with their souls on a deeper level. And that completes the class. I hope you enjoyed it. To those that don't have a book, you can still get a book. We're still part of Shemais with us in the first three portions of Shemais. We have another many portions to go. So hopefully that you will get a book and you can still be part and really keep these texts so you'll have it with you. Also, I want to mention that this Thursday night we're having a unbelievable speaker, Rabbi Moshe Brisky from Los Angeles, California, at 7 p.m. Not at 7:30, at 7 p.m. We're going to have he's a phenomenal speaker, world-renowned speaker, speaks around the country, around the world. And he's going to speak on the Rebbe's vision and to the world, we're coming up to Yud Shvat, which is the day, it's the 70th year of the Rebbe becoming the leader of Chabad in the world. And it's this Shabbos, but we're going to start celebrating on Thursday night. So hopefully I'll see you all on Thursday night at 7 p.m. Rabbi Moshe Brisky, you're not going to, I promise you that you're going to enjoy his speech. Number two is we're having another phenomenal JLI class coming up, the Journey of the Soul. I'm telling you, you don't want to miss this class. It's going to be also on Zoom, and on those who want to come in person, we're also going to have it in person in the Chabad. Already over 25 people have responded to this class, but this class deserves many, many more people to be part of. I'm telling you that this 6-week course that's coming up, the Journey of the Soul, is something you don't want to miss. And please sign up to this class. And I promise that you will not regret this upcoming class, the Journey of the Soul, which is starting February 4th on a Thursday night at 7:30. You're going to really have a wonderful class. I wish you all a great night. And if you want to come tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., we continue Chitas, the Chumash and the Tanya of the day, which is also a phenomenal learning. Have all a wonderful night. Learning never ends. Education never ends. And may we continue to learn, to go strength for strength. And as in this week's portion, we went out of Mitzrayim, may we all be redeemed out of Galus. May we all dance like Tzeinar Akdosh to the Holy Land. The coming of Mashiach, B'mheira, B'yameinu, Mamash, speedily in our days. Have a good night, everybody. Laila Tov.